Dear learners, welcome to this 4-week online course in effective communication skills for personal and professional development. In the first week, within the first module, Basics of Communication, Concepts, Process and Models, today we are going to have the second lecture in which we will learn about the communication process. Here is an outline of today's lecture. We will at first try to know about communication in brief. Then we will try to understand the importance and purpose of communication. There will be discussion on the elements of communication. We will briefly refer to different models of communication and how communication works within a system, different barriers which hamper smooth communication. We will talk about that also, and then there will be some activity and questions for you. Communication, as we all know, is derived from the Latin word communis, which means to make common, to share, or to participate. Communication basically is a two-way process of sharing or exchanging information, ideas, or feelings, and it is a dynamic process of encoding, transmission, and feedback in verbal as well as non-verbal manner. Before we proceed, it is important to understand that the evolution of humankind has been coterminous with the evolution of communication process. You may recall how human beings invented fire, and fire became the first very significant signal for the purpose of communication and interaction. At the same time, communication is also to be understood that when speech is just a behavioral aspect of communication, but behind that, a lot of psychological and physiological changes also take place within us when we try to speak. So as we can see that in communication process, there are three major aspects involved. They are psychological in nature. For example, when we want to communicate, we at first get some psychological drive or urge to communicate. After that, we get the idea or the message for communication in our mind. Then the physiological changes begin to take place in our body. For example, the movement of lungs, the movement of windpipe, the air which comes from within the respiratory system, all that become active. And then the air reaches to the oral cavity or the nasal cavity, and accordingly we see that the process of communication begins. Then we utter words or speech sounds, which is the behavioral aspect of communication. So in this way, we see that communication at first is psychological in nature, then it is physiological in nature, and then it is behavioral. It is also to be mentioned here that the communication that we make or establish largely constitutes of non-verbal communication more than the words that we speak. When we have to understand the importance of communication in our life, then we realize that it is necessary for promotion of clear understanding. It is very important because when we interact with others in the process of communication, we try to convey some message, we want to transmit some idea or information, and for that matter, it is equally important that it is clearly communicated. So it helps in strengthening relationship when understanding is clear. It is also important for improving teamwork and collaborative action. Communication is also important because it supports informed decision making, and it also helps us in driving organizational and personal change that we want or desire. When we refer to the purpose of communication, then broadly we find that three major objectives are achieved. First purpose is information. When we have to inform some message or information or data or content to someone, so for the purpose of information, to educate, for exchange of ideas, we use communication. The second purpose is persuasion. We also communicate in order to convince others or to persuade people for some kind of action. And communication is also useful for the purpose of entertainment. So, if we try to understand it further, then we notice that it is important for the purpose of interpersonal interaction. It is important for public speaking and making presentations. It is important also for the purpose of professional growth. It is needed in mass media and advertising sector. It is also very important for the purpose of cross-cultural communication. Say, for example, when we have to interact with people who come from different cultural background, then the meaningful communication is needed, and for that it is very useful. Digital communication is another very important aspect because we are certainly able to enjoy the advantages of digital platform with the help of video conferencing, blogs and different channels. Web channels are there, podcast series, and there are different such platforms and apps which help us establish a smooth communication with the help of digital interface. So we can see that communication serves different purpose in our life, primarily in the form of information, for the purpose of persuasion, and also for the purpose of entertainment. Now, when we talk about communication process, we need to understand that it is a dynamic framework that describes how message travels between a sender and receiver using various communication channels. It is communication process. It means how communication is established, how communication actually takes place. In order to understand, we also need to know that it ensures that the receiver decodes the message encoded by the sender correctly. So, the role of both sender of the message as well as the receiver of the message becomes crucial. It is very important in order to understand how communication effectively works, particularly in larger setup. When we talk about components of the communication process, then these are the key components. First is the sender. The sender is the encoder of the message. The process of communication is basically initiated by the sender, who is the source of the message. The sender should have certain skills in order to be effective encoder. The knowledge of the sender plays very important role. What is the attitude of the sender of the message? What is the socio-cultural background or status of the encoder of the message? All these things matter with regard to the encoder or the sender or the source of communication, because this is the first step. The next very important component is encoding. The sender is there. The sender will try to encode the message because the message has to be transmitted. So, that message which has to be transferred, communicated or transmitted will be encoded by the sender in the form of words or language. Next very important thing is message. What is the content which is to be communicated? So, for that matter, language code is important, content of the message is important, and treatment of the message is also very important. Next component is medium or channel. Even if the sender and receiver are performing their role, transmission of message or establishment of communication will not be possible in the absence of specific or appropriate medium or channel. So we have channel of communication and verbal communication, non-verbal communication. It can be in the form of visual channel, it can be in the form of electronic interface. So medium is another very important component in the process of communication. Then comes the receiver. As we understand that since the message has been already encoded by the sender, we do need someone at the receiving end to decode it. So the receiver's role is equally important as the role of sender is, because if the receiver lacks appropriate knowledge, if the attitude of the receiver is not fit, if the socio-cultural background is not appropriate, then in that case, reception of the message, decoding of the message, and interpretation of the message will fail. So, like sender, receiver's role is also very important in the process of communication, because it is the receiver who decodes the message sent by the sender, and the attitude, knowledge, and socio-cultural background of the receiver also plays important role. Then decoding is the next very important component, and after the message has been decoded, the next important component is feedback. Now feedback usually is not given that importance as is given to the sender of the message or the receiver of the message, but feedback is the most vital component in communication process, and it can be positive, it can be negative also. So once the receiver has been able to decode the message, understand the message transmitted by the sender, there will be some response from the receiver, and that response can be positive feedback, it can be a negative feedback too. It will be in the form of responding to the message, it can be in the form of summarizing the message, or also in the form of reflection, the feedback can be given. Next component is noise or barriers, which may be psychological in nature, which may be physical or environmental or semantic, it can be personal also. So in the process of communication, we aim to have a smooth transmission of message from sender to the receiver, but at times there are certain undesirable factors also in the form of noise or barriers which try to hamper the smooth communication process. So therefore it is also very important that we try to keep such components away, we try to avoid such factors which may lead to hurdles or barrier in the process of communication. Here we see that through this visual and flow chart, the process of communication has been demonstrated. We see that how message is encoded by the sender, then it travels through channel, then it is decoded and it is received by the receiver. Importance of feedback and the role of noise has also been highlighted. Here is another image to demonstrate the same. Then we need to talk about channels of communication, because we have just learned that in the process of communication, medium or channels play important role. There can be verbal communication, verbal channel of communication, which includes face-to-face conversation when we meet our friends, when we meet our colleagues, our relatives, then we interact face-to-face. Over phone calls also when we are interacting, or through video conferencing when we talk to someone, then we are usually using verbal channel of communication. We can have non-verbal channel of communication too, where we refer to body language, eye contact, silence, gesture. We all know that it is not only the words that we speak, but our words are always supported by appropriate body language or gesture. So non-verbal communication also is very important in the process of communication. Next important channel is written communication. Many times we have to communicate through written text. So our text messages, the documents that we write, the letters that we write, application, all these are forms of written communication. So channel of communication also involves written platform. Another channel is visual. Visual communication involves communication through the medium of graphics, charts, signals, diagram. Some symbols can be used, colors can be used, flow charts. So all these come in the category of visual channel. And then we have the next channel, which is digital. And we understand that in today's time, digital platform has acquired great significance, and social media, blogs, websites, different apps, they are being now used for the purpose of communication. So digital platform, digital medium of communication is also playing significant role in enhancing the process of communication. So these are the different channels of communication which play significant role in a smooth communication process. Models of communication. In order to understand communication process, now that we have already referred to its different components, it is equally important to have some idea about the models of communication. It can be broadly of three kinds: linear, interactive, and transactional. As far as linear transmission is concerned, as you can make out, it is one-way communication. For example, when the receiver of the message is not playing active role in the process of communication and only the sender of the message is active, then it becomes one-way transmission or one-way communication. So it is linear communication, which is sender specific. The message is largely controlled by the encoder of the message, and computer mediated communication is one very important example of linear transmission. For example, I write an email to someone. So in that case, my communication will be largely controlled by me, and the response to my email may not come immediately, instantly. So this kind of communication, you can understand, comes in the category of linear transmission. The next model of communication is interactive. As the word suggests, interactive model of communication involves that the participants in communication alternate the positions of sender and receiver. It is a two-way communication process where both the sender of the message as well as the receiver of the message, they are both playing vital role in exchanging ideas and information. Here a new message is generated and returned to the original sender in the form of feedback. So interactive model of communication involves the role of both the speaker as well as the listener. The third model is transaction. As the word informs, here we find that the sending and responding takes place simultaneously. So this can be used to describe how listeners use nonverbal communication like body, posture, facial expression to give some form of feedback. The cultural context encompasses the social identities of the communicators in this context. So as we see, it is a kind of transaction of information or message. Both the sender of the message and the receiver of the message, they are simultaneously involved in the process of exchange of message. Now we see that within an organization or a system or institution, when communication is taking place, then there are different forms involved. For example, on the basis of how information travels, how communication is directed, we can have upward communication, there can be downward communication, lateral or horizontal communication, diagonal communication, and grapevine communication. In subsequent lectures, this will be discussed in detail. As we have seen that in order to have a smooth transmission of message from one end to another end, in order to have successful process of communication, different components are required to play their role sincerely. At times, we find that there are certain unwanted factors which begin to interfere in the process, and the communication process is hampered or negatively affected. These are the barriers. The barriers may occur in the process of communication in the form of lack of knowledge and experience. For example, if the encoder of the message or the sender of the message or the speaker lacks sufficient knowledge or has incomplete information on the subject or does not have sufficient content in terms of message to communicate, then that may lead to barrier in the process of communication. Presentation order can also affect the process of a smooth communication. Lack of familiarity with the audience. As we all know that when we speak, then it is evident that there will be someone to receive the message or listen to us. So therefore, many times, particularly in spoken communication, it so happens that we are not familiar with the nature of the audience. So what is the nature of audience? What is going to be the size of the audience? What are the expectations of the audience? All that play important role. But if the speaker or the encoder of the message fails to assess this, then it can also become a barrier in the process of communication. Problem in message transmission. There can be some physical barriers also, environmental barriers also. There can be some technical glitch also that inhibits the smooth message transmission. If because of these factors the message will not be properly transmitted, then that will also impact upon the success of communication process. Problem in receiver's comprehension. As we have seen that if the knowledge, attitude, preparation, abilities of the speaker is important or sender of the message is important, then the competence of the receiver of the message also becomes very important, because in that case, if the ability or the competence or the knowledge of the receiver will not be sufficient, then it will impact the comprehension or understanding of the message. Cross-cultural diversity. When we have to communicate our message to such audience, such people who belong to different cultural background, when there is linguistic diversity, cultural diversity in the audience, then also sometimes it becomes difficult for the sender or the speaker to encode the message properly or transmit it. Trust and honesty, they also affect the process of communication, because if there is no trust between the speaker and the receiver or the listener, then the message communicated will not be properly received. Perception and various other physical barriers also play role. If we are biased, if we are prejudiced against someone, then our process of communication may be affected because of our subjectivity. So these are some of the barriers in the process of communication which need to be avoided and eliminated. Now here is some activity for you. You have to list the 7 C's of communication. and you have to imagine your world without a speech, and if possible write a brief note on it. Make note of challenges that you will face in that case when the world will be without speech. List three differences between human communication and plant communication. You may also refer to these links in order to learn more on the topic of communication process. Thank you.